Some dogs are abandoned for a reason. I learned that the hard way. I found him halfway through my daily morning run. I had traversed the winding jogging track as it cut through the wooded portion of the park, before making its way to the top of a little hillock, slicing it into two clean halves. It was at this little summit that I first heard it. This soft, barely audible whining coming from somewhere beneath the hulking oak tree to my right. I stopped and I took a moment to catch my breath, which turned into little puffs of visible steam as it interacted with the cold, wet air after escaping my mouth, making me look like an overworked smokestack. He was peeking at me through a tiny gap in the unkempt grass that he was using like a shield, as soft rays of the early morning sun fought their way through the thick cloud cover and fell on his large brown head. I quickly scanned the surroundings to confirm that indeed, there wasn't anyone else anywhere nearby. What in the world was this dog doing here all alone? I wondered. Had he been abandoned? Was he lost? He didn't look like he was wearing a collar. He looked almost longingly at me, and so I decided to investigate. He barked softly, and his tail began to wag as I trotted over to him. But maybe I got a little too close too quickly, because he suddenly threw up his tail like a battle standard, and he growled softly. Mixed signals, huh? It was possible that whoever had left him here had also abused him. That would be a likely, if heartbreaking, explanation of this odd behavior. I decided to respect his boundaries and retreated to a distance I thought would make him feel safe. "Hey there, buddy," I said in a voice as sweet as saccharine. "What are you doing here all alone?" He cocked his head to the right and began looking at me in amazement with these strange, almost human-like eyes. I snapped my fingers in rapid succession and I whistled tenderly, letting him know that I posed no threat to him. He howled delightfully as his bushy tail began sweeping the air once again. I patted my thighs. "Come here, boy. Come." He sprinted towards me, trampling the grass with astonishingly long strides, startling me with his speed. I thought he was going to bowl me over, but he ground to a halt right outside of my reach, licking his lips and wagging his tail nervously. I instinctively bent towards him, but stopped when he looked warily at me. Better be safe here and let him take the lead. He hesitated, but began slowly approaching me, his nose buried in the ground, sucking up all the interesting smells as he kept watching me from the corner of his eyes, cautious but hopeful. His whole backside started jerking left and right as his nostrils reached my shoes, and he howled in elation before licking away at my shins. He then jumped up, standing on his hind legs, as he put his front paws on my waist for support, his tail turning into a blur. I crinkled my nose as he blew air in my face. His breath was rank, like a rotting corpse. Oh God, why did it smell so bad? Was he sick? Is that why he was abandoned? I fought through the repulsion and brought my hand down to his head and began petting him. He really liked that, and showed as much to me by rubbing himself against my legs. He then backed up and jumped at me again, playfully biting at my fingers. I threw my hands up in the air, far out of his reach, and so he went down and started nibbling at my shoelaces. Hell, he was energetic, hopping from one place to another, running circles around me, barking, whining, biting, scratching. Just an endless bundle of energy. If I'm being honest, it was getting to be a little bit much. His bites and scratches were starting to hurt, though he hadn't broken my skin yet, thankfully. It was when he caught my pants between his teeth and began shaking his head furiously that I decided to speak up. "Stop, that's enough," I said gently but firmly. "Stop it." He looked up at me questioningly, the fabric of my pants still tangled up in his mouth. "Drop it," I said. He didn't listen and continued to bite at my leg, his teeth digging into my flesh. I decided to be a bit more stern. "No!" He froze and I could feel his whole body tense up. He came at me again, trying to bite my knees, so I said no again, much louder this time. He reacted by baring his teeth at me aggressively, as the hairs on his back stood up. It was a shocking change, going from playful to such a violent behavior in a matter of seconds. I felt a little nervous as I took in the baleful snarl on his face. Should I not have been so stern? "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice a little unsteady now, not knowing how he would react. He growled threateningly as his eyes hardened and he began nipping at the air, his teeth gnashing awkwardly, sending a tingling sensation crawling down my spine. Jesus, what was the reason behind this sudden transformation? The dog almost looked rabid at this point. It suddenly dawned on me that I was all alone here. If he decided to attack me, which seemed to be a certainty now, I would have to fight him off all by myself. I wanted to defuse the situation, but he didn't look like he wanted to do anything other than to attack me. He lunged at me, snapping his teeth dangerously, and I brought my foot up to push his face away, taking care not to hit him. But with the way that he was looking at me, I doubt my restraint would last, not if I wanted to avoid getting bitten. He came at me again, this time wrapping his teeth around my shoe and biting with all his might. I quickly swung my leg and he jumped away to safety before charging at me again, fangs bared, ready to sink his canines into my flesh. I kicked at his head, more out of desperation than a desire to hurt the animal. But he was far too nimble, easy dodging my attack and pouncing on me again, and again and again. He circled me like a predator, eyes sharp, growling menacingly. There was actual malice on his face. He didn't just look like your average angry mutt. There was something much more vicious going on here. Sweat gushed down my brow and stained my pits as my heart began pounding so hard in my chest that I feared it would burst out any second. This had turned into a very dangerous situation, and my fight or flight instinct was kicking in hard. Anything that gets me out of here. He leapt at me one more time, but this time I connected. It was but a glancing blow, but it was enough to daze him. And I took full advantage of that and I took off running, not looking behind me even once. But I could feel him hot on my heels, his breath warming the back of my knees, teeth always inches from tearing off chunks of my flesh. I pumped my arms and legs as I ran, fear and adrenaline pushing me past my limits. Down the incline of the hillock, past the towering pine trees, over the little wooden bridge. I ran and ran and ran, and the freaking dog kept pace with me. If it hadn't been for my years of practice of running, he would have caught me a long time ago. However, I was starting to run out of breath, and as his teeth scraped my shin, I knew he was going to get me soon. Salvation came in the form of voices just up ahead. With renewed vigor, I picked up speed once again, even as my lungs threatened to explode in my chest. The dog trailed off when people started becoming more visible, then just tiny dots in the distance, and he soon disappeared into the foliage, leaving me a wheezing, shivering mess. Really? A little puppy traumatized you this much? my wife asked, her eyes twinkling with mirth and mischief. I pulled up my pants and began applying the cream to my leg. That was now white all over with scratches and bites, none of which had thankfully drawn blood. "You should have seen him, Amy," I replied, still feeling a little unsettled. "It's not just that he was huge, but I don't know. There was just something wrong with him, you know. The way he became so aggressive so suddenly, how persistent he was, just..." "You sure you don't want to go to the hospital?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern now. I shook my head. "It's fine, really." "You really should," she said firmly. "Okay," I relented. "I'll swing by after I get off work." "Do you want me to kiss it and make it better in the meantime?" "I would really like that." By the time I made it back home that evening, I had mostly put that morning's incident aside, rationalizing it just as an oddity, even though I was a little apprehensive about running into that dog the next morning. Thankfully, I didn't have to get rabies shots, and since I was already up to date with my tetanus vaccine, my visit to the doctors had been relatively short. I turned in early that night. Work had been especially tiring. At first, I didn't understand what exactly had woken me up in the middle of the night. I blinked my eyes open and noticed these soft beams of moonlight passing through the arched glass windows, forming hypnotic whitish shimmering strips on the tiled floor. A mournful howl reached my ears, jolting me to alertness. Goosebumps formed on my arms as I instantly understood who was making that sound. No freaking way. I sprang out of bed, pushing the quilt aside and scrambled for the windows. I drew the curtains aside and I peered outside. Our house was located on a quaint little cul-de-sac, right where the road loops around, giving me a wide view of the neighborhood. Out there beneath a flickering streetlight that intermittently swept aside the darkness was the dog, sitting patiently and howling to his heart's content. My heart started racing. What in the world was he doing here? He stopped, sharply swung his head around and began staring at me hatefully. I don't know how, but he knew that it was me standing here at the window looking at him. I shuddered as I met his malicious, piercing gaze, feeling more naked and exposed than I had ever had. He snarled and began slowly walking towards me, fangs bared, ready to pounce. It was so bizarrely terrifying. Why was he here? What did he want? "Amy," I whispered, my voice so fearfully low even I couldn't hear it. I gulped and I cleared my throat. "Amy." "What?" She groaned, and the sheets rustled as she began to yawn. "It's him," I said, the curtains shaking as my hands trembled. "The dog. He's here." "Go back to sleep, baby." "Get off my freaking lawn, you mutt," came the voice of Mr. Kowalski from his house lying to the left of where the dog was. Something crashed against the trash can in the front of my house, making a loud, booming sound. "Out!" my neighbor screamed again. The dog stopped, turned to his right, hackles raised, chest rumbling slightly, and darted towards Mr. Kowalski's house, disappearing from the short reach of the streetlight before I could so much as blink. The screaming started almost immediately. This heart-wrenching, soul-crushing screeching that sounded like someone's death throes. I felt fear, no, sheer primal terror coil around my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Oh my God, what was that? I jumped, the fear nearly making me yelp. I turned my head and I looked at Amy, sitting up, fully alert with her eyes wide open. "Call 911, I said as I reached for my phone. "What's happening?" "Just do it." I grabbed my ball bat and went bounding down the stairs, jumping over 2 steps at a time, pure adrenaline pumping me forward. I was already out the door and sprinting towards Mr. Kowalski's house before I could even begin to contemplate just how stupid it was to bum rush this thing. Other neighbors were groggily coming out of their homes, wondering what the hell was happening in this quiet neighborhood at 1 in the morning on a weekday. "Call 911, I screamed while pointing at them. "Mr. Kowalski's house." I didn't wait for the reactions and I ran up to Mr. Kowalski's yard. The short, dewy grass tickling my slipper-clad feet, and I entered through the door that had been left ajar. I stopped and I started groping around for the light switch, but soon gave up, and I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the way. I hadn't even taken a couple steps into the house when I heard a clattering sound and something flew past me, rubbing against my legs and making me drop my phone. I turned and I saw the dog skittering off into the darkness. The most frightening thing about this was that the dog I just saw wasn't the one that had attacked me this morning, and the one that had just charged into this house moments ago. And Mr. Kowalski doesn't have a dog either. What the hell is going on? I picked my phone up off the ground and swung it around. The light it emitted vibrated in the air as my hands shook in fear, before falling on a corpse splayed out on a coffee table in the center of the living room. His throat was ripped off, and the oodles of blood that had gushed out of his body had stained the table, before pooling on the hardwood floor below, and began glowing under the light from my phone. It was the dog that had been scaring the living daylights out of me since this morning. His brown fur now looking lifeless and carrying splotches of dark, coagulated red blood. Mr. Kowalski's walking stick was lying on the floor beneath the corpse, forsaken by its missing owner. I was horrified and beyond confused at this point. Why was this dog dead? Who was the dog that just ran out of this house? And not to mention, the owner of the house was nowhere to be seen. My brain was working overtime, trying to solve this puzzle, to figure out what the hell was going on here, when loud screaming brought me back to reality. My heart almost jumped out of my mouth when I recognized Amy's voice. Before I realized what was happening, my feet were moving and I was running back to my house, shoving past some people who were coming to the crime scene to investigate, while praying that my wife was alright. The smell of death rushed down the wooden staircase and assaulted my nostrils as I entered my house. No, 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 please, no. I started climbing the stairs, slowly because I feared what was waiting for me up there. Halfway up there, I heard noises that made me want to retch, to run far away from this place. Crunch, squish, bones were being shattered, flesh was being chewed on, blood was dripping on the floor. My brain was going into overdrive, conjuring up horrific images that were threatening to drag me down into the void of insanity. I clutched my baseball bat tighter and I plodded on, trying hard to stamp out the images from my mind. I heard something shuffling around, making scratching noises as its clawed paws rubbed against the hard floor. I stopped outside my bedroom, the source of the sounds which sounded so painfully loud from here. After taking a deep breath, I walked in, using the phone to light up the room. What I saw there wasn't what I was expecting, not even close to it, and it will continue to haunt me till the day I'm lowered into my grave, maybe even beyond it. The dog that had run out of Mr. Kowalski's house was lying dead on the floor of my bedroom, its throat ripped out, and my wife was hunched over the corpse. Amy? I whispered as I shone the light on her. Crunching, squishing, cracking. The sounds rang loudly in the quiet room, bouncing around the walls before harshly invading my ears. It was Amy. She was biting the dead dog's flesh and eating it. Her gnarly-looking hands now sprouting vicious little claws as clumps of hair fell out from her fast balding head. Her arms were pockmarked with puncture wounds, scars of the short battle she had fought with the dog who was now laid out like a scrumptious meal in front of her. The dog may have died, but I had a sinking feeling that it had gotten what it had really wanted. I grunted involuntarily at the repulsive sight in front of me. Her head shot up at my voice, and then was cocked to the right. She saw me, fur and flesh hanging from her mouth, and growled.